This is an important verse from a Hindu text, Ramcharitmanas, which is a text glorifying the deeds of Lord Rama, who is the chief deity of the Hindu pantheon. The first line of the verse is pretty evident in pointing out an idealistic truth which is of great importance in metaphysical discussions and sheds light on the reality, on the ontological reality of the world and how the world is inherently information based, knowledge based. One of the chief distinctions between the idealist and the dualist philosophy is that idealists believe world to be of the form of knowledge, while dualists believe the world to be of the form of matter. Dualists believe that the world crafted of the matter is then populated by the soul, which forms the real world objects as they exist in front of us, while the idealists believe that the whole world is just created out of knowledge and there is no subject object distinction in practice. The first line, thus, is very crucial in making us understand the philosophy. So, the first part of the first line goes like this. Translated into English, it would read something like, only those know you to whom you make yourself known. This is obviously talking about God, but in a greater breadth, it is talking about the world itself. Only those people can know God and the reality of the world whom the God wants to know these things. This points the importance of revelation. A lot of atheists and rationalists hate the idea of revelation and point out the problems, supposed problems in it. To counter them, there is a great array of presuppositionalists who try to argue that knowledge from revelation forms the key basis for all types of knowledge that can occur in the world. The first verse supports the idea of the thoughts of presuppositionalists. The only way we can know something is if we have justification to believe that that thing is true, and that thing indeed is true. And the only way that it is possible is if that knowledge of the reality of the thing comes from the person who already knows the thing. This is in philosophy is known. This point is in the philosophy is made by the problem of knowledge, a thought experiment of problem of knowledge. From where does knowledge come? Can knowledge be ever acquired? The only way to get real knowledge is to gain the knowledge from the person who already has that knowledge, because any other way of gaining knowledge would be faulty, because there would be no guarantee that the thing that you are gaining is knowledge and is not something else. So, the only way to know the reality of the world and to know God is to know the world and the God through God Himself. This is the first part of the first line. The second part of the first line roughly translates as knowing you, they become you themselves. This is the most crucial line in this verse from the perspective of idealism. And this is where idealists and dualists separate to such a large extent that they will not converge by any sort of means. This part says that knowing the truth, the person himself becomes the truth. The truth here refers to God. What does it mean? Well, the only way to know about Someone who is a personality, a person, is to be completely aware of all the attributes of the person. But the only way that is possible is to live like that person himself. The only way to really know the attributes of a person who is personal, who has the characteristics of a personal being, is to be that personal being, because you cannot understand the thoughts and motivations and actions of a person unless you try to partake uh, in the identity of that person. Unless you are really that person yourself, you will not be able to gain true knowledge of the person, because the knowledge would always be from a lack of subjective point of view, while as the actions that the person is committing is from the subjective point of view. The actions of the other persons would always be in your mind to be an object of analysis and not the lived experiences of yourself, though the actions that are being committed by the other person are being committed based on his own lived experience, on his own lived experience. As such, there is a potential problem, a potential gap between the two types of analysis that cannot be bridged in normal and natural circumstances. The only way to bridge that gap would be if you become that person yourself. Thus, knowing that person, you become that person. There would be no distinction between a person who knows a thing from the thing itself. This may sound to be a pretty esoteric point of view, which appears to be obviously false from the dualist or materialist perspective. We know certain things. We know about certain things without being those things themselves. But the problem here is that we only know about those things from the point of view of them being objects to our experience or objects to our knowledge, but not from the point of them being the subject. But their utility in a particular action, it's from their being the subject of that experience. As such, this distinction of the subject and the object presents a problem in which we cannot know the thing completely, because our perspective of seeing that thing is different from the perspective that the thing has about itself. This problem is also related to the problem in idealism, or the problem in quantum mechanics, the subject object problem. The people who believe in the idealist interpretation of the results of quantum mechanics believe that the person who is doing the experiment, who is doing a quantum mechanical experiment, is part of the experiment itself, and thus this, the experimental setup is not a distinct object from the person. The person is present in that setup himself, and as such cannot distinguish himself from the experimental setup, and thus his own consciousness affects the results of experiment. So the bound of the experimental setup includes the subject who is performing the experiment. As such, there is no distinction from the perspective of the experiment between the experimenter and the objects that are being used in experiment. Both of these things are the objects from the perspective of the experiment which is being performed. But from the perspective of the subject who is performing the experiment, only the experimental objects are the part of the experiment. As such, the analysis of the scientist or the person who is performing the experiment misses his own intake into the experiment, and as such, the results of the experiment always contain a term of error, which is because of the randomization induced by us not knowing uh, the effect that the experimenter is having on the experiment. To understand that, consider the argument that is given by people who make an argument for the idealistic interpretation of quantum mechanics. If there is a particle that is somewhere and you want to know the position of the particle, the only way to know the position of the particle is to, by observation, is to point a light at it. But the moment you point out a light at it, it gains energy. And by gaining the energy, it moves. It gains kinetic energy and acquires a different velocity than the velocity it was acquiring earlier. As such, because of that movement, its position and velocity both change, and there is error in both position and velocity. Even if you know the position of that particle exactly, there would be a great error in the velocity of that particle. And that is because both the things cannot be known at the same time. That problem is created because the way the subject is measuring the features of the particle puts the subject into the same experimental setup that the particle is in, and the procedures that he is employing also affect the particle, because the procedures that he is employing affect the particle itself and form the experiment. If he does not include those effects, then the experiment will not yield accurate results. But there is no way for him to easily incorporate the effect of his own presence on the experiment. The only way that it would be possible in some world would be if his essence is same as that of the experiment and the objects used in the experiment. And that because the objects used in the experiment to the experimenter are of the essence of knowledge and information, his own reality must be of the nature of information or knowledge. As such, because both the subject and the object are of the essence of knowledge, the whole world then must be of the essence of knowledge because it is nothing more than the subject and the object. The subject and the object form a universal set of all things present in the world, and as such, universe cannot be anything more than the subject and the object. As such, the idealistic doctrine of the world being of the essence of knowledge holds in this regard that the experimenter who is performing the experiment is part of the experiment itself, and because he is part of the experiment itself, it follows that he must be interacting with the objects of the experiment, and to interact with the objects of the experiment, he must be of the same nature as the objects of the experiment. In that regard, believing that the objects can only interact if they share a similar essence, believing that one arrives at the conclusion of idealism being true and the reality being way different than what classical physics tells us, and the boundary of distinction between the subject and the object being completely meaningless and arbitrary.